So I'm going to get that started. Okay, and you will get a link to a recording as well as a copy of the slides at the end. And those of you who need the SHRM credits, I'll be giving you the presentation number to enter that into the system after the presentation is over as well. I also send out a survey at the end, not at the right at the end of the presentation, but along with the slides, I'll be sending out a link to a survey, which again is really helpful feedback for me so that I know where I can improve. And it also always asks for ideas for what you'd like to hear about. Especially with it being a new year, you've all just probably gone through open enrollment, and I'm sure your heads are spinning with certain HR things. And I want to know what you want to know about so that I can gear these webinars to what it is that's really relevant to what's going on out there. I think the last year and a half, it's been very focused on staying on top of COVID and all the different legislation that's been going on with that. We hope that this year is going to be a little different. Maybe we can do a little bit more of returning to some of the pure HR things, like organizing your employee files that hopefully you'd be doing whether we were in the middle of a pandemic or not. So a couple more housekeeping things. We have Anita Prouty with us. If you know her, she might be your account exec. She's going to be monitoring the chat. I'm also hoping that if I pause to say, does anybody have questions, feel free to unmute yourself as well. I'm trying to make this as interactive as we possibly can be. So feel free to unmute as we go. And I'm thinking this will probably take about an hour. I had it down for an hour and a half, but I don't anticipate it's going to take up that time unless we get into some really good discussion. Then it might last a little bit longer than an hour. So here we go. So welcome everybody. Glad you were able to join us. I always like to start off by reminding you that I am not an employment attorney. I always touch on legal issues because you can't help but do that with HR nowadays, but I'm not here to give any kind of legal advice. Please don't construe anything that I say as legal advice because it's not. And those of you who have worked with me before, you know that I'll be the first one if I ever get a question that I think is really slipping over into that legal realm a little beyond my comfort zone. I will always say, reach out to your employment attorney on that. So what we're going to talk about today is employee files. This is a question I have come up regularly from clients saying, how do I organize them? What should I be keeping together? How do I find things? Do I file things electronically? Do I keep paper? What do I do? There's a lot of questions out there about that. So hopefully we're going to be able to demystify some of this for you. We're going to talk about who should have access, the confidential nature of employee files. There are some mandatory rules that you should be following in order to be compliant in your file organization. We'll be touching on that. And then, really it's wide open for a lot of options of how you want to be managing your files. And hopefully we can give you some ideas as far as what's going to work for you. So what I want to do, I want to start off with a poll because I want to get an idea of where everybody is as far as your files, whether you do them electronically, whether you have them primarily still the old-fashioned in folders in a file cabinet, or whether you have some sort of a hybrid. So I'll give you a few minutes to fill that out. Okay. So can everybody see the results? Okay, good. It looks like a little more than half of you are still in the paper zone. And my guess is that eventually you're going to want to change over to do it at least somewhat electronically. But not too many are actually primarily electronic, although that's a little higher than I've probably seen in the past. Okay, so this gives me a good idea of where everybody is and what I should be talking about and how I should be gearing this. That's really helpful. Thank you. It really doesn't matter whether you're keeping your files in paper form or whether you're doing it electronically, because a lot of these things that I'm going to talk about, it doesn't matter. You need to be organizing them the same way, whether they're on paper, whether they're electronic. Who has access to these files is going to be the same, regardless of what format that they're in. The retention requirements are going to be the same. So if I'm not absolutely differentiating between paper and electronic, just assume that it applies to both. The two things that you should really keep in mind as you're coming up with a filing system, this is kind of the go-to, is who's going to need to see the information that's in this file. That's really important because you want to make sure that you don't have somebody seeing information they don't need to see. And ease of retrieval. How easy is it going to be for me to get this information if I need to find it? If it's something that you go to on a regular basis, you're going to want to have it right there at your fingertips. If it's something that you're keeping just because the IRS says you need to keep it, but you're probably never going to have to use it, then it can probably be somewhere where you're not going to need to take a look at it all the time. But anything that you're going to need to pull out on a regular basis, you're probably not going to want to have in a big, thick file with a whole lot of other papers. So keep in mind always who's going to see it and how easy is it going to be for me to find it when I need to find it. That need to know piece is really key. Whoever has access to any of your employee files should really only have access if they need that information to do their job. So usually if you have a designated HR person in your organization, whoever does HR absolutely should have access to these files. Payroll generally needs access to these files. They might not need access to all the employment information, but there's a lot of information covered on the payroll side that whoever is running payroll is going to need to pretty readily access. Anybody else who needs access to a file from time to time should always be doing it under supervision. And we'll get into the whole security thing in a little bit, but what I wouldn't do is just allow your managers to say, hey, can I see so-and-so's HR file? And then say, sure, and hand it over to them and walk away. I think it's important that the gatekeeper be with whoever it is that's looking at an HR file. And maybe even just pulling out the information that manager really is out to see. File cabinets, I can't emphasize this enough. We all get a little bit lax as far as access, and seeing that most of you, the majority of you, still have at least some form of paper files. Some of you are remote, some of you are in an office. If you're in the office, the only time that cabinet should be unlocked is when you're right there with it. So if you're working remotely, make sure that cabinet is always under lock and key. And the reason I mentioned don't forget about terminated employee files, what I've seen a lot of is I'll come into an organization to do an HR assessment. One of the things I do is take a look at employee files, and I want to see how they're organized and give some feedback on that. And then I'll say, well, where do you keep your terminated employee files? And the organization says, well, we box them up and we put them downstairs into our storage closet. Well, the storage closet's not locked. So there you have somebody's payroll information, their social security number, never mind their employment information. There's some really confidential information sitting in a storage room that isn't under lock and key. So it's a really common, it's just something you wouldn't think about. You're just thinking about cleaning out your files and getting them out of here because you're probably never going to have to refer to them again. But just make sure that even if they're terminated, they should still be under lock and key. And I also get asked the question too, should the employee see their file? And I don't see why they shouldn't. There shouldn't be anything in an employee file that they're not aware of. But again, it should be viewed under supervision. What I like to do also, if you have an employee that comes in and says, I want to see my personnel file, that's fine. But the first question that I would tend to ask an employee is, oh, okay, that's fine. We can do that. What is it that you're looking for? Are you looking for something in particular? Because sometimes they're just looking for something really specific, like, well, I'm looking for who I designated as my beneficiary on my life insurance because I might want to make a change. In which case you can say, oh, okay, let me pull that form for you, as opposed to actually handing over the whole file and having the employee going through every little piece. I would say at least 50% of the time, they're looking for something really specific that you can go through, find for them, make a copy of it, and send them on their way. Sometimes you do get the employee who wants to look at it because they think that they've been wrongfully disciplined and they want to see all the notes that are in their file. And, that's probably okay. But again, make sure that you're actually sitting with them as they go through it. If the files are electronic, I think everybody password protects that. I think that's kind of common sense. Hopefully it is. And again, that password should only be shared with people who are going to have a reason to get into those files. I would even hesitate to have your senior managers. Sometimes you have groups of files that all of your senior managers have access to. I wouldn't include your HR files in that. So just remember, need to know, your CEO is probably never going to have any reason to be looking at an employee file. And if they do, they can come to you and you can sit down and you can go over it with them. So, and even if the files are electronic, treat it as if it's paper. You can always call it up on your computer screen and sit down with the person who wants to see it and go through what's in there. So it shouldn't, I would not just say, oh, here's the password to our employee files, go ahead and take a look. I think it's important to kind of keep that control. And I think your employees would appreciate that. I think you as an employee yourself would appreciate the fact that it's very, very limited access to your private information, including things like your social security number. So why are we so concerned with all the security? Well, you don't want to be the one that's caught sleeping on the job, right? Because if this information gets out, if there's any kind of a security breach and personally identifiable information, such as social security numbers, ever get out there, it's going to come right back to you. So I'm not an IT person by any means, but make sure that your organization has the IT security that it needs, that you can't have people hacking in and just looking at your employee files. So have that conversation with your IT person about how secure are these files. So in addition to that personally identifiable information, your files are probably going to have protected health information. Whether this falls officially under HIPAA privacy laws or not, you don't want somebody's health information getting out. You don't want doctor's notes, information from a medical provider for family and medical leave situations. That should all be kept very confidentially. And, tampering, it does happen. All the more reason why nobody should ever be able to walk into your office when you're out having lunch and quick grab a file and pull a few things out of it. It does happen. So again, the security piece is really important, and you in an HR role, that definitely falls under you. I would suggest having some sort of an actual employee record security policy. Most organizations have some sort of an IT security policy. Take a look at that and see if it specifically covers employee records. If it doesn't, you might want to include it in there, or it may in a broad sense cover your employee files, but I kind of like to see it at least specifically mentioned in a policy like that. Or you could have your separate standalone policy of how you maintain your employee records, whether they're electronic or whether they're paper. And in that, you should clarify who has access. And you don't have to get into the details of only HR and payroll has access. You can say, only anyone who would need the information that's contained in the files will have access to these files. Talk about that level of supervision, how nobody has access to files without supervision of one of the gatekeepers. And the importance that your organization puts on to the confidentiality of this records. And then anybody who actually in your organization has free access to these files, you don't have to do this, but I don't think it's a bad idea to actually have them sign a copy of the policy, or at least have them sign something that says, I understand that I'm going to have access to this confidential information and that I will maintain that confidentiality. And I've seen this come up very often if somebody hires a new payroll person, because that, again, that payroll person has access to a heck of a lot of information. And it's never a bad idea to have them just sign off on that separate acknowledgement saying, hey, I know I have information here that nobody else has access to. I'm not going to use it for my own purposes, and I'm only going to use it for business related reasons. So for example, somebody has to fill out a census form to get life insurance. They're going to be pulling a payroll record and sharing that with your broker at NFP. If you're going through a workers' comp audit, you're going to have to pull information. So in those cases, yeah, it's going to be okay to share the information. But other than that, if you have access to it, you shouldn't be looking at it and saying, well, I can't believe so-and-so is making so much more money than I am. I should be paid more than that. For some managers, that's a real concern, that they think that their employee, whoever has access to this, is going to use it to their own benefit and say, I should be making more money because I know what so-and-so is making. And, having them sign off on that confidentiality piece just kind of plants that extra seed that you need this to do your job, and that's it. So there are a couple of things to do to get started. If you have one employee file that has everything in it, which is not uncommon, very often, it's just you've inherited a filing system. Nobody else really filed things very carefully initially, and you've inherited a bunch of files and they're this thick, and it's just everybody's employment information into one. You're probably going to want to start segregating some things out. So to get started, these are the folders that really need to be removed from your HR files. Your I-9s. A lot of organizations file that within each individual employee's file. The best practice is to pull it out. Keep all of your I-9s together. I'll go through that a little bit more in the next slide. The reason being that if you ever do get an audit from Customs, USCIS, US Customs and Immigration Services, they may give you very little notice and say, I want to see your I-9 forms. If they're scattered within your employee files, you may very well have to hand over an entire employment file. And then again, you're divulging personal information that you don't want anybody else to see. Either that or you're really scrambling to try to pull it out of all of your files. So if you keep them separately, you should be able to say, okay, I'll meet you here tomorrow, and then just hand them over a binder that has all the I-9s in it. Your declaration of healthcare forms. The state of Vermont actually says they should be retained for 2 years, and they should be retained together. So you should have a folder or a binder. I would recommend just doing it by year of all of your declaration of healthcare forms. Whether you're ever going to get audited or not, who knows, but you may have to refer to them to do your quarterly taxes, just to make sure that you're falling under that threshold of where you're going to get the surcharge. If you do any kind of an EEO survey, if you're a federal contractor, if you are large enough to be filing an EEO-1 report, you're going to have your employees after they're hired. They have that EEO survey saying what their race is, what their gender is. That should never, ever be in an employment file. That should be retained separately, total separate cabinet, separate folder, extremely confidential information. You never want to give the impression that that's being used to make an employment decision. So that should absolutely be pulled out. Anybody who has CDL drivers, you fall under Department of Transportation rules. And those rules say that you need to have a separate DOT file for all of your drivers. So any kind of information that has to do with their CDL license should not be in their regular employee file. It should be retained in a separate folder. Background checks, same thing, because it's very private information that can come back in a background check or a credit check, and they should be kept outside of the file. You can file it by person. You can put them all together and then destroy them after a certain period of time, whatever you think works for you. But again, have it set up outside of the employment file. So just touching on the I-9s a little bit, because I do tend to get asked questions of how do I retain the I-9s? Again, when I do HR audits, sometimes when I go into organizations, they hand me a huge binder, and it's a binder of people who have been terminated for years, and it's still there with your active I-9s. One thing that I can say about USCIS is they're going to go easier on you if they see that you have a nice system in place. If they come to audit you and you hand them a binder that's got people who haven't worked for you in years, that's going to be a red flag to them to start digging deeper. If you're organized on the surface, they might go, I can't speak for what they're going to do, but they might go easier if they do find some issues with how the forms have been completed. So what I recommend is having all of the active I-9s in one binder or folder, and then all of the terminated I-9s in another binder or folder. If you retain any kind of a checklist for employee terminations, I would add on there to move the I-9 from the active file to the inactive file, so that it just becomes a habit of so-and-so has terminated. I take the I-9 out of the active I-9 binder, put it in the terminated binder. And on top of purging that terminated I-9 binder, the system that I found always worked for me when I was sitting in your seat was to just make a note on the top of it of when it can be destroyed. And the retention is 1 year after the employee's been terminated or 3 years after their date of hire, whichever date is longer. So when somebody was terminated, I do the calculation of, okay, I can shred this at the end of 2024. And I would put it in chronological order of everything that can be terminated in 2024. So at the end of 2024, I can pick up that whole folder and put it right in the shredder. And then you're constantly on top of it. So, and you can make that part of your annual purge. Beginning of the year, you can say, okay, everybody that I could have purged in 2021, I'm just going to do it beginning of January of 2022. It's really easy for the organization of these files to just slip away from you because we all get busy. So the next thing that I would do after you've segregated those pieces that should absolutely be segregated out is I would set up what I would refer to as an employment file. And this is going to be anything that could potentially be used in an employment decision. So it's going to be anything from your pre-employment process. That would be your resume, any kind of an application. Again, we're assuming that there's nothing private on there, like a social security number. There really shouldn't be. At this point, you really shouldn't be asking for a social security number. If you need it to do any kind of a background check, that's usually after the person has been given an offer of employment, and it should be off of the application. But just in case you still have an old application with it on there, if it's on there, then the application shouldn't be in the employment file. Offer letters, that should be in there. If they do a handbook acknowledgement, that might not be used in an employment decision, but it actually could be, because if you have somebody who's violated a policy that's in your handbook, and you might be making a decision based on the fact that they violated this policy, you're going to want to have evidence that they actually did get that handbook and they had access to that policy. So that should be part of it. I am big on job descriptions. If you don't have updated job descriptions, I'd strongly recommend that you do it. I could probably talk for an hour just on that. And a best practice would be to have the employee sign the job description. If that's part of your practice, that's great. The signed job description should go in that employment file. Anything that has to do with their work history, their performance appraisals, that can go in there. If you give them if there's any kind of a note saying they got, positive feedback from a client, that should go in there. Any kind of record of they've been promoted to a different position should go in there. Obviously, any kind of disciplinary actions should go in there. Trainings, again, unless it's some sort of a training that has to do with being a CDL driver, because that would go in that CDL file. Your training records can go in there. I have seen organizations who are, say, for example, in very sensitive industries like manufacturing, where they retain their training records separately. And that's fine, because that might work for you if you have OSHA coming in on a regular basis, whatever works for you. But they certainly can be part of that employment file, because you can be taking a look at what trainings that they've done when you're making a potential decision as far as, promotion, or, yeah, they really not qualified for this because they haven't done this, or this is what we need them to do in order to get to that next level. So you're kind of getting the feel for, what should be in there. When the employee leaves, any kind of a checklist that you have, that should go in there. Anything that documents why they left. Anything that you get from unemployment, that can go in there. If you get an unemployment verification, that can certainly go in there. If there's any kind of a separation agreement, that would go in there. A resignation letter will very often be a documentation of why that employee left. So that should be in there. So, when you're thinking about the employment file, think about, does it have to do with their employment? Would it have been used? Is it part of their employment, the employment decisions that we may have made would have been based on what was in that employment file. And it also should be something, this is something that, say, for example, an employee's manager should be able to take a look at and kind of see a history of what they've done with your organization, where they've been. So it shouldn't be anything that you wouldn't want that employee's manager to see. So when you're putting that file together, as I just mentioned, would I allow a hiring manager to take a look at this, or am I divulging any information that they shouldn't have? If the answer is, yeah, no, there's something in there that they shouldn't see, then they should take it out. Common in an employment file would be somebody brings in a doctor's note to justify an absence. That shouldn't be there, because doctor's notes could potentially divulge some of a health condition that you wouldn't necessarily want to have shared. So if you have an attendance problem, there should be some documentation in there about why they're absent. That's okay. But if that note has anything in there that divulges somebody's health condition, it shouldn't be in there. And that can get a little bit tricky, but a lot of doctors are pretty good at keeping those notes relatively generic and just saying they can't come to work because they're under my care. Does the employee know about what's in this file? And if the employee hasn't seen it, it shouldn't go into the employment file. Nothing in the employee's employment file should come as a surprise. So if you do get that random employee coming in and saying, I don't think I've been treated fairly, I want to see my employment file, they shouldn't be finding notes in there from their supervisor that they didn't know were in there. They should have at least acknowledged everything that's in there. And there are a couple of reasons for that. And you don't want your managers just writing up notes about an employee and saying, here, can you put this in their file? Because if there's ever any kind of a legal action, one of the reasons is that file becomes, in legal terms, discoverable. So an attorney can say, okay, I need to take a look at that employment file. And there could be notes, random notes in there that, they might not be saying what you want them to say in a way that you want them to say it. My recommendation is always, if you have a manager saying, I want to see that this gets into their file, make sure that the manager is sitting down with the employee and discussing whatever that is, whatever that issue is, so that the employee is aware of it. And it's really not all that fair to the employee that somebody's keeping a whole bunch of notes in their official file and they don't know about it. If it's enough that a manager wants to document it, it's enough that the manager should be sitting down with that employee and discussing it. Now, if the manager wants to just keep track of a few little things on their own, they can do that and they can keep it in their own desk, but it shouldn't go into their employee file. I would totally recommend that a manager take their own notes and keep it separate so that they have something to refer back to if it's a recurring issue and they're not really sure, wait a minute, when did that happen? Did that happen last fall? Did it happen over the summer? They've got some sort of note about it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in their actual employee file. Do we have any questions on that?
I do have a couple questions in the chat, Susan. Is now a good time to go over those?
Absolutely, yep.
Okay, so one of them is there more information on the EEO survey? We are a federal contractor with 9 employees. I don't think we are currently doing this.
9 employees, you may not have to because you're small and your contracts might not be large enough. And that's getting a little bit out of my realm. And I'm trying to think, honestly, your attorney could probably tell you more of whether you're required to actually maintain an affirmative action program. I doubt it. So I think you're probably okay in not doing that.
I thought affirmative action programs, those were only for 50 employees and over.
It might be. I'm not sure what the threshold is to actually, if you're a federal contractor, I know it's the size of the contract. It might also be the number of employees. I'm not sure, but you know what? I should refresh my memory on that. So I will respond to the group afterwards and let everybody know. So what the answer to that one is, because I'm a little rusty on that.
And then the other question is, where should we store COBRA reimbursements? With employee file or with healthcare docs?
I would put that with healthcare docs.
For terminated employees also?
Yeah, I would, and again, it depends, and we're going to get into this in a little bit as far as how you can organize anything other than your employment file. So you have a number of different options, but I would just absolutely make sure that it's not in the employment file because it has to do with their healthcare and whether or not they were enrolled in your healthcare program, which again, you never want to give the impression that you might be, say, for example, rehiring or not rehiring an employee because they did or did not participate in your healthcare plan. And that's why healthcare information should be out of the employment file. Because you don't want somebody saying, I don't want to hire this person because I know they're going to put their family on the healthcare plan. I'd rather go with the one that isn't going to take advantage of our healthcare plan. So healthcare information should always be separated out. So good question. And there had been a lot of COBRA correspondence going on with the COBRA subsidy. So yeah, just make sure that that's not in your employment files.
And that's it. We had those 2 questions. Thank
Okay.
you.
So here we get into that realm of, okay, you've got your employment file set up. What do we do with everything else? And here you actually have a lot of leeway of how you want to do it. The most basic way to do it is you've got, I'm visual. I like my graphics. You have your one file cabinet or one electronic folder, and that's got your employment files in it. And then in a totally separate file cabinet, you've got your confidential file. What I wouldn't do, for those of you who are paper, I wouldn't have your employment file and your confidential file within one folder with that employee's name on it. I would keep it totally separate. So I would have all our employment files here, all of our confidential files over here. Because again, you never want to give the impression that that information is going to commingle. And by keeping it separate, you are decreasing the opportunity for that information to become one and the same. Okay, so you could take everything that doesn't belong in your employment file and just put it into a confidential file. And again, that confidential file is something that a manager should never have access to. There'd never be anything in there that a hiring manager would ever need to know. So that's one way of doing it. And in that confidential file, you can put your medical forms, you can put your benefit enrollment forms. If you have pre-employment physical, that could be in there again, unless it belongs in that DOT file. You could have your disability, your workers' comp information, all your medical information, ADA accommodation requests. That's another thing that I would strongly recommend. If it's in an employment file, I would pull it out of there, because again, an ADA accommodation really has, you making that accommodation, you don't want the impression to ever be given that employment decisions are being based on whether or not you've had to accommodate somebody. So those anything that has to do with making an ADA accommodation should definitely be pulled out. You can basically mix in your benefits forms, your payroll forms, emergency contact information, all that could just be put into one confidential file. And there are pros and cons to that. And again, this is where it comes down to what works for you. As long as they're in that separate file cabinet and they have limited access to that confidential file, that's fine. On the plus side, it's a catch-all, which is kind of good. You just know that if it doesn't belong in the employment file, you can find it in the confidential file. The downside is it can get cluttered really, really fast. And if you think back to one of those first slides with retrieval, how easy is it going to be to find something if it's mixed in with a whole bunch of other forms? So it might make sense to actually break out that confidential file a little bit more, but it kind of depends. If it's electronic, it can be, and it's searchable, it can be a little bit more cluttered. If it's a bunch of paper, you might want to break it out a little bit further. So this is just a suggested alternative. You could have that employment file, and then you can separate out that confidential file you can have your benefits in one folder. That would work. And that way, anything that has to do with benefits administration, you should have pretty easy access to that. Some of you might have already have benefits information online because you've got an online benefits enrollment system. So you may already be retaining benefits information online. That's fine. Again, the key is, can you retrieve it when you need it? You could have a separate payroll file. And again, sometimes your benefits file and your payroll file can kind of commingle, because in order to figure out what payroll deduction you're going to take, you have to look at the benefits file to see what benefits they enrolled in. So that's where it can get, it can get a little bit intermingled, and it can get confusing because you might have things filed in one file because one person thought, well, that belongs in the payroll file. Another person thought, well, that belongs in the benefits file. You've had people doing this job in the last years, and things are all mixed in. And then you could have a confidential file kind of as a catch-all for everything that doesn't belong in a benefits file or doesn't belong in a payroll file. So again, it's just one suggestion of what might work for you. And as far as your best practices on this, again, you have to find something that's going to work for you. One of the plus sides of going electronic is you can store more information. One of the downsides is it can get really cluttered really fast with things that you don't necessarily need. Consistency is really important, especially if you've had some turnover in, say, for example, payroll or in that HR role. And how one person has it set up, another person might come in and they're filing things totally differently. And you've got things filed all over the place. So some sort of consistency, maybe just an ongoing list of what common forms that you use go where, so that it can be consistently handed down from person to person. One thing that I would definitely suggest is that you have a separate file for each FMLA situation and each workers' comp situation, because they can be ongoing. And I find that it's easier to be able to retrieve if, say, for example, you have somebody who is going out on on FMLA. If you just take all the information and throw it into a benefits file, it's not all that easy to pull out if you need to. Whereas because you might have a lot of medical documentation coming in on that, you don't know. I find it's much easier to just put it into one FMLA file with that person's name on it per occurrence. So that if any questions ever come up about somebody's FMLA leave, because again, that's a federally regulated leave, or if you're under 50 employees and more than 10, you're following the state leave. So again, it's statutory. So you're going to want to have that file very readily accessible and organized so that you can very clearly show that you've been following the regulations that to follow. The same thing with workers' comp, because workers' comp can get really tricky. You can have an injury that you think has gone away, and 3 months later, that person's missing time again because of the same injury. And if you've got everything lumped into a confidential file, you might be missing, you might think that you've pulled out all the relevant workers' comp information, but you really haven't. It's still mixed in with some of the paperwork that's in that confidential file. So I think it does make sense that you have a folder with the person's name on it per FMLA occurrence, the same thing per workers' comp leave. Now, FMLA and workers' comp leave could be one and the same, and that's fine, but have all of that relevant information together, easily accessible so that you can very easily show compliance. Some of the pitfalls that I've seen when I've talked to employers or when I have gone in to do HR assessments is sometimes they get a little carried away with those different folders. And there are so many different folders that there's a lot of crossing over, like I mentioned before, with the benefits folder and the payroll folder. And you've got things misfiled all over the place. And you might have 4 or 5 different folders within the employee's employment folder. And it's all mixed in anyway, because things have been misfiled over the years. Because remember, you might be really meticulous and really organized, but your predecessor, maybe not so much. So too many folders tends to be a bit of a pitfall. Too few folders, on the other hand. I've seen folders, especially with companies that have long-term employees, where they've got handwritten vacation request forms going back 15 and 20 years, all sitting in a single employment file. I can tell you employment files have been this thick, and it's full of stuff that you just don't need. So that goes into that lack of purging. You really should take the time to go through and take some of these things out that you really don't need anymore. Many organizations, you're not writing down on a piece of paper requesting time off anymore. It's done electronically. There's no reason in the world why you need to keep a request on hand for vacation time that's more than a year or 2 old. You just don't need it. And I think if you still do that, put that in a separate folder so that you can really easily just get rid of it. It's not really all that relevant. So yeah, too few folders, and you can end up being all gunked up, and that catch-all folder, you can't find what you need when you need it. Inconsistency, especially if you've had some turnover in these roles, tends to be a problem, because a really nice filing system that somebody might have set up 5 years ago just isn't being followed. So you're ending up with a catch-all folder anyway. So I wanted to give you a little bit of information on retention, because this is another question of, well, how long do I have to keep these things? When can I purge these files? SHRM has put, SHRM, which is Society for Human Resources Management, has a nice retention list, and I'm going to send that to you along with the slides. That should be helpful. But that's only focusing on federal retention. It doesn't mention any, it doesn't have anything on state retention. And I haven't been able to find one single document that talks about how long the state of Vermont wants you to keep things. And remember, if you're a multi-state employer, you're not just dealing with the state of Vermont. If you've got a single remote employee in California, you have to deal with the California retention laws. So while there are definite advantages to having remote employees scattered around the country, it does make HR management a little bit more difficult because you have to educate yourself a little bit on different employment laws in different states. So one tool for doing that is XyWave, your XyWave portal, which you should all have access to. It used to be HR 360, but it's now, it's been bought. It was bought by XyWave a couple of years ago. They're now going by XyWave, and everybody should have a portal set up in that. There were emails that went out last fall about setting up your portal. If you, I would imagine that you all have access to it, but if you don't know you have access to it, let me know and I'll see that you get on there and that you get another invitation to set this up, because XyWave, you can go to a state resources tab and you can get a really good handle on what some of the state requirements are if you've got remote employees in other states. So good tool to have. Let me know if you don't think you have access or you don't know that you have access, and I'd be happy to get another introductory email out to you. So the difficulty with retention is you've got so many different federal and state laws out there and that are saying you need to hold on to this for X number of years and that for X number of years. And so within one single employment file, you generally have multiple different retention periods. So how long do you hold on to an employee file? It's generally safe to hold on if you get rid of an employment file 7 years after the employee terminates. If, however, that employee was involved in any kind of an employment related dispute and that dispute's still going on, you obviously don't want to get rid of that employment file. But generally, if you get rid of what would be referred to as a personnel file 7 years after the person terminates, you're generally meeting the retention requirements of everything that would be in that file. Payroll records, so if you have, usually now it's electronic records of timesheets and time cards, generally 5 years is the retention for that. Your medical enrollments say 6 years after the plan ends. You know, that can get a little bit tricky, and I've seen employers who actually keep all of their enrollments together in one folder, everybody's enrollments together in one folder. You could do it that way. I still prefer to have it in an individual benefits file per person. I just find it's easier to find and easier to retrieve. But 6 years after the plan ends is the general one on that. Your I-9 forms, again, we talked about that. It's 1 year after the employee's employment is terminated or after the date of hire, whichever one is longer. Your declaration of healthcare forms, it says right on the form, 2 years on that. So that one is pretty easy. FMLA records are 3 years. So again, it's another reason why it's pretty easy to, it's easier to do that and keep the files from getting gunked up if you've got a separate FMLA record per employee, so that you know if you're ever cleaning out files, well, this person was on FMLA 5 years ago, we don't need to keep this anymore. Out it goes. Can you tell I like to purge? I like to clean up. COBRA. It says there are, because this question had come up of, you know, how do we retain the COBRA? As far as how long you retain COBRA, there's no actual requirement on that. But I have heard it recommended that you hang on to it for 6 years. Not really sure why, but I think 6 years is fair. And it's kind of along the lines of hang on to a terminated employment record for 7 years. So if you just hang on to everything that has to do with that employee's employment for 7 years, you're probably keeping the information for a sufficient amount of time. Credit reports, they are somewhat regulated. You're supposed to keep them for at least 1 year. And there is some sort of a law out there that says that they have to be shredded. So bear that in mind. Always be cognizant of when you're getting rid of things, you want to put them in your secure shred, or if you actually have a shredder, put them into the shredder. Drug tests say 1 year for drug test records for any of you who drug test. If it's a DOT related position, 5 years. So again, some of this is going to be touched on in that SHRM document that I'm going to be sending out, but the state stuff is not. So again, as I just emphasized to you, I cannot tell you enough the importance of shredding and also of keeping those terminated employees locked up and not just in a generic storage cabinet. So do we have any questions?
We do. We have a couple new questions. Hold on here. It says, would you want the emergency contact information more accessible? If it is password protected, electronic, or locked in a cabinet, how can it be reached in an emergency?
You know, that's actually a good point. That could potentially be somewhere a little bit more accessible. But again, I don't think you just want to have that out and about, because it's going to have people's contact information, their personal phone numbers on it. I would say to kind of take a look at who would potentially need that emergency contact information and give them access to that. So if you're, say, an on-site, say you're primarily on-site, an on-site organization, but you as the HR person work remotely quite a bit of time, designate somebody who's on site as having access to that. You know, maybe this is where having it available electronically isn't a bad idea, because then somebody would have access no matter where they are. They don't have to physically be in the office to have access to it. So maybe that's a thought, but you know, I would say whatever works for you. But I don't think that I would just keep it out in an open file cabinet where all of your employees would potentially be able to go in and grab it. I would still limit it to people that you think agency and give them access to it. Does that help?
This next one, Susan, I think it has you pretty much answered it. They were saying their emergency contacts are in a file that is accessible to all employees. And is that a bad idea? I think you really answered that in the first question. Unless you want to elaborate more.
Well, you know, and I could a little bit. And Kay, I'm seeing you on. And I know that when I dealt with Laura, that we had been discussing how to get emergency contact information for people that are out in the field. So I'm not sure if this question came from you or not, but you know, it kind of depends. So like if you have employees that are not working on site, they're out on a field somewhere, make sure that whoever's in charge of that group out in the field has access to that person's emergency contact info. So it's kind of it depends. But hopefully I've been able to kind of point you in the right direction of whoever would be there, potentially be a go-to, I think, should have access to that. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, there's two more that just came in. What about electronic employee files for keeping documents separate? Can you have it so that certain file types are only accessible to HR or employees or managers when a report is run?
When a report is run. I'm not really sure I'm understanding this. Do you feel comfortable unmuting and kind of walking me through that a little bit?
Yeah, that was from me.
Okay.
We have our files in our employee portal now. So we scanned all the paper stuff in, and we have in our portal, there's different document types that we can select. And so my view, I can see all of the files on one person's thing if I'm on their portal. I'm not honestly not sure how much employees can see right now, because that's something that we are working on, and what can employees see in there. But so when we're saying like things need to be in separate file cabinets, if we just make it so that only certain people can see them when they're in the portal, does that count? Or and like for I-9s, we have it set so that if we need to pull out I-9s, we can say, grab all the I-9s and they'll all be there.
Yeah, and I think that works. So when they're in the portal though, it's very limited who can actually change what's in the portal, right? So they have access to see it, but they can't like pull a form out of there if they need it.
Well, yeah, for some, I don't think they can even see it at the moment.
Okay.
I think I would have to share it with them for right now.
Okay, right. So, I mean, your employees, if they can go into the portal and see their own file, that's totally fine. But they shouldn't be able to change what's in there. You know, that whole tampering thing. Am I answering your question? I'm not really sure I'm getting it.
Well, yeah, I mean, if they can see it, and not everyone can see it, then I think, yes, that sounds good. Because I was getting nervous and I was like, everything's all in the same spot, but not everyone can see it. So
okay. And if you have other questions on that as you're going through it, and it sounds like this might be something you're kind of new to, feel free to give me a call.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And the last question I have is, where should we keep wage garnishment documentation and how long?
I'm not sure about how long. Definitely as long as the garnishment is going on. But as far as where to keep it, as long as it's in with your confidential file, that's fine. If you have a separate payroll file, I think it would definitely go into a payroll file. So I would say wherever you keep things like your W-4 is where wage garnishment should go. That's a good question.
That's it.
That's it. Okay. So does anybody else have any questions? Because I think we are just about wrapping up. Okay. I will be again sending out copies of the slides. I'm also going to send out that retention schedule and the survey. Please, please, please complete the survey. And I want to hear from you, and I want to know what you want to hear about. That's a tremendous help to me going forward. So thanks everybody for coming, and we'll see you next time. Bye.